Rain fell in thin lines over the metal roofs of the outpost, tapping softly against the pipes that ran along the outer wall. Daniel Hale knelt beside a broken water line, his hands stained with grease, working slowly because the tools here were never quite the right size for anything. He had been on this outpost for 11 days, sent as part of a small human engineering team helping repair damage left over from a war that had ended only months ago between his people and the Skarn. The Skarn were not easy to get used to. They were tall, armored, wrapped in scales the color of dark stone, and moved with a kind of quiet power that made most humans nervous. Daniel wasn't nervous. He had grown used to being the smallest thing in the room a long time ago. That evening, as he packed up his tools, he passed by the communal den where a group of young Skarn were gathering for their evening meal. He had seen this every night since he arrived, but tonight he actually stopped to look. 3 young dragons sat around a low fire pit, their scales still soft and pale, not yet hardened by age. They were setting out food, moving with the easy rhythm of a routine repeated many times. What caught Daniel's attention wasn't the 3 younglings. It was the 4th chair. It sat closest to the fire, empty, untouched, exactly the same every night. The younglings placed a bowl beside it, just as they did for themselves, then sat down around the fire without ever looking at it again, as if looking too long might break something. Daniel stood there longer than he meant to. One of the younglings, smaller than the other 2, glanced up and caught him staring. She didn't look afraid. She looked curious, the way children look at anything new. Daniel gave a small wave, unsure if that was even something Skarn understood, and then walked on before he made it strange. The next day, he tried asking about it. He mentioned it to one of the older Skarn workers repairing a generator nearby, keeping his tone light, like it was nothing more than a passing question. The worker's expression changed instantly, the kind of shift that told Daniel he had touched something he wasn't supposed to touch. The Skarn simply said it wasn't his business and returned to his work. Daniel let it go for the moment, but the image of that empty chair stayed with him the rest of the day. Something about it felt familiar in a way he couldn't quite explain, not yet. That night, Commander Lewis called him into her office, a small metal room lit by a single overhead light. She had heard about his question already. News moved fast on a base this size. "You've been here 11 days, she said, not unkindly. "That's not enough time to understand what you're poking at." Daniel didn't argue. He respected Lewis, and he understood the position she was in, caught between a fragile piece and a species that still didn't fully trust humans. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some strange custom to be left alone. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to understand it." Lewis studied him for a moment, then sighed. Understanding and interfering aren't the same thing. Just be careful which one you're doing. Daniel nodded and left it there for the night, but he didn't stop thinking about it. He had grown up waiting for someone who never came home either. He knew what it looked like when a child set a place at the table out of habit, hoping today might be the day. He recognized it because he had lived it. Over the next few days, Daniel found small reasons to be near the den in the evenings. He wasn't trying to sneak around or force his way into anything. He simply worked a little later, fixed a pipe a little closer, stayed within sight without ever stepping into their space. He never went near the fire. He never looked directly at the chair. He just let himself be present at the edges of their world, quiet and steady, the same way he approached most things in life. The younglings noticed him before the adults did. The smallest one, the one who had waved back that first night, started watching him from a distance whenever he passed. The other 2 mostly ignored him, one too guarded to care, the other 2 busy being loud and restless to notice much of anything. On the 5th evening, Daniel finally worked up the nerve to ask someone who might actually give him a real answer. Bren, the Skarn warrior who watched over the 3 younglings, was repairing a section of fence nearby. Daniel approached slowly, keeping his hands visible, a habit from working around large machinery that also seemed to work well around large alien warriors. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Bren didn't look up right away. "You already have questions everyone else avoided answering. I assume this is another one." "The 4th chair," Daniel said simply. "Who is it for?" For a long moment, Bren said nothing at all. The only sound was the wind moving through the fence wire and the distant crackle of the youngling's fire. Then, without turning around, Bren finally spoke, his voice low and heavy in a way that made Daniel understand. Even before the words came, that he had just asked about something far bigger than a chair. Bryn finally turned to face Daniel, his large frame blocking most of the fading light behind him. When he spoke, his voice had lost its usual sharpness. Her name was Vaila, he said. She was their mother and my sister. Daniel stayed quiet, sensing that Bryn needed to get through this in his own time and his own order. She died 8 months ago, Bryn continued. A border patrol near the ridge line. It should have been simple. It wasn't. The war between humans and Skarn had officially ended only recently, but Daniel knew ceasefires didn't stop every death. Small skirmishes still happened in the months before the final agreement was signed, quiet incidents that never made it into any official record humans ever saw. The 3 children, Daniel said carefully, they're hers. Bryn nodded. Rook is the oldest. Thorn is the middle one, always causing some kind of trouble. Cinder is the youngest, the one who waved at you. He allowed himself a small, tired smile at that last part. Daniel finally understood the pieces fitting together. And the chair. Before Vaila left for that last patrol, she made them a promise, Bryn said. She told them she would always be home before the fire went out, no matter how long the patrol took. It was something she said every time she left, a small thing between a mother and her children. That last time, she never made it back to the fire. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He knew exactly what that kind of waiting felt like. The terrible patience of a child who refuses to believe an absence is permanent. They still set the chair every night, Bryn said. I've tried to explain it to them differently. I've tried other things. Nothing changes it. Some things, I've learned, cannot be rushed. I'm not trying to rush anything, Daniel said. I just wanted to understand. Bryn studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to weigh more than curiosity behind it. Understanding is one thing. Interfering with grief is another. Among my people, that is not a small line to cross. Mourning is private. Even family keeps a distance until it is offered. Daniel accepted that without argument. He had no interest in forcing his way into something that wasn't his. But he also didn't think staying completely away was the same as respecting it. Over the following weeks, Daniel kept working near the den in the evenings, never approaching directly, never asking to be included. He fixed a section of broken piping that ran past their living space. He repaired a light fixture that had been flickering for months, something none of the adult Skarn had gotten around to since the war ended. He didn't make a show of any of it. He simply did the work and left. The younglings noticed anyway. Cinder was the first to grow bold enough to approach him directly, walking up one evening while he adjusted a length of cable, watching him work with wide, curious eyes. She didn't say much, mostly pointed at his tools and made small questioning sounds, the kind any curious child might make regardless of species. Daniel showed her how the cable connector worked, careful and patient, letting her hold the harmless end of it herself. Thorn came next, though not in the same gentle way. He was louder, more restless, the kind of youngling who tested boundaries just to see where they were. He once grabbed one of Daniel's tools without asking and ran off with it, only to return it the next day looking slightly guilty, as if he expected to be scolded. Daniel never scolded him. He simply thanked him for bringing it back and asked if he wanted to learn how it actually worked. Thorn, despite himself, stayed and listened. Rook was different from his siblings. He kept his distance longer than the other two, watching from farther away, arms crossed, clearly the one most aware of what their mother's absence actually meant. He didn't approach Daniel at all for the first 2 weeks. When he finally did, it wasn't with curiosity like Cinder or mischief like Thorn. It was almost like a test, as if he wanted to see whether Daniel would treat him the way adults sometimes did, with pity or forced kindness. Daniel didn't do either. He simply nodded at him and kept working, treating him the same as he treated anyone else. Elder Sarah, who oversaw much of the outpost's Skarn population, eventually heard about the human who kept finding reasons to work near the morning den. She was not pleased. She summoned Daniel one afternoon, her expression carrying the same weight Bryn's voice had carried that first evening. You are aware, she said, that what you are doing borders on disrespect. I'm not trying to disrespect anything, Daniel said honestly. I'm not trying to replace anyone either. I just don't like watching kids wait alone every night for someone who isn't coming back, especially when I know exactly what that waiting feels like. Sarah studied him carefully, clearly unconvinced but also unwilling to dismiss him outright. She said nothing else, simply turned and walked away, leaving Daniel unsure whether he had just made things better or considerably worse. The following weeks settled into something that almost resembled routine, though Daniel never let himself think of it that way. Routines were fragile things, easy to lose, and he understood by now that nothing here belonged to him. Still, the pattern held. Every evening, once his official work was finished, Daniel found some reason to be near the den, some small task that needed doing nearby. Commander Lewis, though she watched all of it with an uneasy eye, eventually stopped pulling him aside about it, choosing instead to remind him just twice a week rather than every single day. The human contingent, small as it was, had begun noticing an odd shift in how the Skarn workers treated them, a slight warming that hadn't been there before. Lewis suspected it had something to do with a certain engineer and 3 younglings, though she never said so directly. One evening, while repairing a length of fencing not far from the fire pit, Daniel felt eyes on him and turned to find Rook standing several feet away, arms crossed the way he always stood, watching without a word. Daniel didn't say anything either. He simply kept working, giving Rook the same space Rook seemed to want. After a while, Rook spoke, his voice flat, but not unkind. "You keep coming back." "I do," Daniel said. "Why?" Daniel considered the question honestly instead of giving some easy answer. "Because nobody should have to wait alone every night for someone who isn't coming. I know what that feels like. I figured maybe having someone nearby, even someone who doesn't say much, might help a little." Rook didn't respond right away. He simply sat down a short distance off, not close enough to be friendly, but closer than he had ever come before. They stayed like that for a long while, neither speaking, the sound of the wind and the distant fire filling the silence between them. It wasn't much. It wasn't a breakthrough by any obvious measure, but it was something, and Daniel understood that with someone like Rook, something was worth more than it looked. Thorn, in contrast, made his affection loud and obvious almost immediately. He started sneaking away from evening meals to find Daniel wherever he was working, peppering him with questions about human tools, human machines, and eventually human life in general. He asked about Earth, about whether humans had claws, about why Daniel's skin was so soft compared to Skarn scales. Daniel answered everything patiently, even the strange questions, and found himself smiling more than he expected to during these conversations. Cinder remained the easiest of the 3, following Daniel around whenever she got the chance, showing him small things she found interesting, a smooth stone, an unusual insect, a scrap of shiny metal. She had taken to sitting near him during his repair work, not doing much beyond watching, occasionally handing him a tool when he reached for one, as if she had appointed herself his assistant without being asked. Bryn watched all of this unfold with a complicated mixture of caution and quiet relief. He had spent 8 months trying to hold his sister's children together after her death, carrying a weight none of the other adults fully understood, and watching someone else share even a small part of that weight was both strange and welcome. One evening, after the younglings had gone to sleep, Bryn found Daniel finishing up his work near the fence and approached him directly for the first time since their earlier conversation. "You remind me of her," Bryn said, without any introduction. Daniel looked up, unsure how to respond to that. "Vaila," Bryn continued. "Not in appearance, obviously. In the way you keep showing up. She was like that too. Stubborn about the people she cared for, even when it made no sense to anyone else." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, letting the moment sit without trying to fill it with words. Elder Sarah, for her part, continued to watch from a distance, though her opposition had softened into something closer to careful observation. She had not approved of Daniel's presence, but she also hadn't forbidden it, and among the Skarn, that quiet non-interference was its own kind of statement. The days grew shorter as the season shifted, the winds turning colder each evening, carrying the faint metallic smell that Daniel had learned meant a storm was building somewhere over the ridge line. The outpost's automated systems had already flagged unstable weather patterns forming to the west, the kind of storm that could knock out power if it hit hard enough. Nobody paid it much attention at first. Storms came and went on this world, and the colony's systems had weathered worse. Daniel noticed it anyway, the way the air felt heavier in the evenings, the way the younglings' fire crackled a little more violently in the wind. He didn't think much of it beyond a passing thought, filing it away the same way he filed away most things that weren't immediately urgent. He had no way of knowing yet just how much that storm would change everything. The storm arrived 2 nights later, faster and stronger than anyone at the outpost had predicted. What the automated systems had flagged as a moderate weather event turned, within a few hours, into something far more dangerous. Thick clouds rolled in over the ridge line just after sunset, and by the time the first heavy rain began falling, the wind had already grown strong enough to rattle the metal panels along the colony's outer walls. Daniel was finishing a late repair near the main power relay when the first warning alarm sounded, a low, steady tone that meant every worker needed to secure their equipment and get to shelter. He moved quickly, securing what he could, then made his way toward the human housing block, assuming the storm would pass the way most storms did. It didn't. Within the hour, the wind had grown violent enough to tear a section of solar paneling loose from one of the outer structures, and the resulting power surge knocked out electricity to nearly half the colony, including the section that supplied the den where the younglings lived. Commander Lewis called an emergency gathering of the human team, organizing efforts to secure the main power systems before worse damage occurred. Most of the Skarn warriors, including Bran, were called away to help stabilize the colony's central reactor, a task that required every capable adult they had. That left the younger and more vulnerable members of the Skarn population, including Rook, Thorn, and Cinder, without protection during one of the worst storms the outpost had seen since the ceasefire began. Daniel learned this almost by accident, overhearing 2 Skarn workers discussing the den's power failure while he helped secure a supply shed. Young Skarn, he knew from casual conversation with Bren weeks earlier, were far more vulnerable to sudden temperature drops than adults, their bodies not yet developed enough to regulate heat properly without external support. A den without heating during a storm like this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was genuinely dangerous. He didn't think about it for long. He grabbed a portable heating unit from the supply shed, along with a length of cable and a spare battery pack, and made his way out into the storm before anyone could tell him not to. The walk to the den, normally a short and easy distance, became something else entirely in the storm. Wind pushed against him hard enough to slow his steps, rain soaking through his jacket within minutes, the ground turning slick and uneven beneath his boots. He kept moving anyway, driven by the same stubborn instinct that had kept him coming back to that den every evening for weeks. When he finally reached the entrance, he found the 3 younglings huddled together in the dark, Cinder shaking, Thorn trying to act braver than he clearly felt, and Rook standing protectively in front of both his siblings despite being frightened himself. The moment they saw Daniel, something in all 3 of them visibly loosened, the fear replaced, at least partly, by relief. Daniel worked quickly, setting up the portable heater and running the cable to the battery pack he had carried with him. The unit wasn't built for a space this size, but it was better than nothing, and he positioned it as close to the younglings as safely possible. When a section of the den's outer wall groaned dangerously under the wind, threatening to give way entirely, Daniel moved without thinking, placing himself between the weakened structure and the 3 children, shielding them with his own body until the worst of the gust passed. The night stretched on longer than any of them expected. The battery pack eventually failed sometime past midnight, leaving the small heater useless. Daniel didn't panic. He gathered whatever loose material he could find, blankets, spare cloth, anything that might hold in warmth, and built a makeshift shelter around the younglings, keeping the small fire pit alive by hand, feeding it carefully whenever the wind threatened to snuff it out completely. He stayed awake through all of it, watching the fire, watching the children, refusing to let either go out. Cinder eventually fell asleep against his side, exhausted from fear and cold. Thorn held out longer, trying to help feed the fire alongside Daniel, insisting he wasn't tired even as his eyes grew heavier. Rook stayed awake the longest of the 3, sitting close, watching Daniel work through the night with an expression that had shifted from caution into something closer to trust. By the time the storm finally broke, gray light beginning to creep over the horizon, all 3 younglings were asleep, safe and warm despite everything the night had thrown at them. Daniel sat exhausted beside the fire, his hands raw from hours of feeding it by hand, his jacket still damp from the rain, but he didn't move, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace of the moment. That was how Bryn found them when he returned at first light, hurrying back from the reactor site the moment the storm cleared enough to allow travel. He stopped at the entrance to the den, taking in the sight before him, the three younglings safe and sleeping, the fire still burning steadily, and Daniel sitting quietly beside them, having clearly given up any sleep of his own to keep them that way. Elder Sarah arrived only minutes later, drawn by word of the storm damage throughout the colony. She stood beside Bryn at the entrance, saying nothing at all, simply watching the scene for a long moment before turning and walking away without a word. Word of the storm spread through the outpost quickly, though Daniel tried to downplay his part in it whenever anyone asked. Commander Lewis wasn't nearly as willing to let it go unnoticed, quietly commending him in front of the rest of the human team, though Daniel brushed off the attention as best he could. He hadn't done it to be praised. He had done it because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He spent the following 2 days resting, his body worn out from the long night, his hands still sore from hours spent feeding a fire by hand. Bryn checked on him more than once during that time, bringing food, asking after his condition, lingering a little longer each visit than the last. Something had shifted between them, though neither spoke of it directly. On the third evening, once Daniel felt steady enough to walk without favoring his sore hands, he found Bryn waiting near his quarters as the sun began to set. "They want you at the fire tonight," Bryn said simply. Daniel wasn't sure at first what that meant. He had spent weeks working near the den, sitting at a respectful distance, never once approaching the fire pit itself. The invitation caught him off guard, and something in Bryn's expression told him this wasn't a casual gesture. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked. "It wasn't my decision," Bryn said. "It was theirs." They walked to the den together, the evening air cool but calm after days of storm damage still being cleared throughout the colony. As they approached, Daniel could see the fire already lit. The three younglings gathered around it exactly as they always were, for chairs set out in their familiar arrangement, 3 occupied, 1 empty. Except tonight felt different, the air around the fire carrying a weight Daniel hadn't noticed on any previous evening. Rook stood as they approached, his usual guarded posture softened into something more open. He gestured toward the 4th chair, the one that had remained untouched every single night since Vaila's death, and said nothing, letting the gesture speak on its own. Daniel understood immediately what he was being asked, and the size of it settled over him heavily. This wasn't an invitation to simply join them for a meal. It was something far larger, a chair that had held 8 months of grief and hope and quiet waiting, now being offered to someone who wasn't the person they had been waiting for. He looked at each of the 3 younglings in turn. Cinder watched him with wide, hopeful eyes, clearly wanting him to sit without fully understanding the weight behind the offer. Thorn tried to look unbothered, though the tension in his posture gave away how much this moment mattered to him too. Rook simply waited, steady and quiet, the same way he had waited through every difficult moment since his mother's death. Daniel understood, with sudden clarity, that sitting in that chair wasn't about replacing Vaila. Nothing could do that, and he had no intention of trying. It was about something else entirely, an acknowledgement that the waiting, in whatever form it needed to take next, didn't have to mean sitting alone anymore. He walked forward slowly and lowered himself into the chair. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No sudden shift in the wind, no grand gesture from anyone present. It was simply quiet, the fire crackling steadily in front of them, the 4 chairs finally all occupied for the first time in 8 months. But the quiet carried something powerful within it, a kind of relief that seemed to settle over all 3 younglings at once, as if a weight they had carried every single night had finally eased, if only slightly. Cinder moved first, shifting closer until she was leaning against Daniel's side, already half asleep within minutes despite the early hour. Thorn stayed more reserved at first, though as the evening wore on, he found small excuses to talk, asking Daniel questions about nothing in particular, simply wanting the conversation to continue. Rook remained the quietest of the 3, watching the fire more than he watched anyone else, though near the end of the evening, he spoke without looking up. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." Daniel didn't have a perfect response for that, so he simply nodded, letting the moment carry its own weight without trying to add anything unnecessary to it. From a distance, near the edge of the clearing, Bryn watched the scene unfold, standing beside Elder Sarah, who had come to observe without announcing her presence. Neither of them spoke for a long while, simply watching the fire and the four figures gathered around it. Finally, Elder Sarah broke the silence, her voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. In all my years, I have never seen a morning chair offered to an outsider. Bren nodded slowly. Neither have I. What does it mean, do you think? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already understood the answer and simply wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Bren watched the fire a moment longer before answering. It means they've decided grief doesn't have to mean waiting alone anymore. And somehow, a human is the one who taught them that. Neither of them moved to interrupt the evening. They simply stood together at the edge of the clearing, watching four chairs finally filled around a fire that, for the first time in 8 months, felt whole again. News of what happened at the den that evening did not stay contained for long. Within days, word had spread through the wider Skarn population living at the outpost. Passed along in the quiet way important stories tend to travel among people who value privacy, but cannot resist sharing something meaningful. By the end of the week, most of the colony, both human and Skarn, had heard some version of the story. The human engineer who braved a violent storm to protect 3 grieving younglings, and who had since been offered a place at their fire that no outsider had ever been given before. Daniel found the attention uncomfortable at first. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone talked about, and he tried to keep his daily routine as ordinary as possible despite the shift happening around him. He still spent his mornings on repair work, still ate his meals in the same small mess hall as the rest of the human team, still avoided drawing more attention to himself than necessary. But the way people looked at him had changed, both human and Skarn alike, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Commander Lewis noticed the shift most clearly in her dealings with the Skarn leadership. Meetings that had once felt tense and guarded grew slightly easier, conversations opening up in ways they hadn't during the earlier months of the ceasefire. She never said so directly to Daniel, but she made a point of keeping him involved in more of the outpost's ongoing projects, recognizing, even if she didn't fully understand it herself, that something about his presence had shifted the entire balance of trust between the two peoples. Elder Sarah, who had once questioned Daniel's motives so directly, eventually sought him out herself, something she had never done before. She found him repairing a fence near the den one evening, the same kind of ordinary task that had first brought him into the younglings' lives months earlier. "I misjudged you," she said, without much preamble. "I believed you were interfering with something you couldn't understand." Daniel set down his tools, giving her his full attention. "I understood enough to know I couldn't fix what happened to them. I just didn't want them to be alone while they carried it." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Among my people, we say that Skarn carry grief like stone, heavy and unmoving, something to be endured rather than shared. I always believed that to be true." She paused, glancing toward the den where the sound of the younglings' laughter carried faintly on the evening air. "I am beginning to think humans carry it differently. Not lighter, perhaps, but less alone." Daniel didn't have a clever answer for that, so he simply nodded, the same way he often did when words felt insufficient for the moment. Bren's role in the younglings' lives shifted as well over the following months, though not in the way anyone had expected. Rather than stepping back now that Daniel had earned a place among them, he found himself working alongside the human more closely than before, the two of them sharing the responsibility of raising 3 children neither of them had been prepared to raise alone. It wasn't always easy. Thorn remained as reckless as ever, testing boundaries in ways that occasionally required both Bren's patience and Daniel's steady calm to manage. Cinder grew more attached to Daniel with each passing week, following him nearly everywhere he went, much to the quiet amusement of the rest of the colony. Rook, though still the most reserved of the 3, began speaking more openly, sharing memories of his mother with Daniel in a way he had never done with anyone else, as if finally trusting that those memories wouldn't be lost or dismissed. Daniel never tried to replace Vaila in any of their eyes, and he made a point of encouraging them to speak about her whenever they wanted to, refusing to let her memory fade simply because someone new had entered their lives. If anything, her name came up more often now than it had in the months immediately following her death, no longer treated as a wound too painful to touch, but as a memory finally allowed to breathe alongside something new growing beside it. Months passed, and the outpost itself began to change in small, but meaningful ways. More human workers found themselves welcomed into spaces that had once been closed off entirely. More Scarn families began interacting with their human neighbors beyond simple necessity, drawn in part by the story that had started with nothing more than an empty chair and a stubborn engineer who refused to let 3 children wait alone. On an ordinary evening, many months after the storm that had changed everything, the fire at the den burned steadily as it always did, for chairs arranged around it, all of them filled. Cinder leaned against Daniel's side as she often did now, half listening to Thorn recount some exaggerated story about his day, while Rook sat quietly nearby, watching the flames with the same calm expression he always wore, though something lighter had settled into it over time. Nobody set out an empty chair anymore. There was no need to. The waiting, in whatever form it had once taken, had finally come to an end, replaced instead by something steady and lasting, built not from grand gestures, but from one small, stubborn act of kindness repeated night after night, until it became something neither species could imagine living without.